paper is the philosophy of law, and the module is liberty and security. The main objectives of this module are to understand the philosophical debates around the balance of liberty and security. The module was written by Manohar Kumar from IIT Delhi, and I'm Akash Singh Rathore from the Lewis University of Rome. So we begin with the context of the debate. Following the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 in New York City, there's been an increasing debate on the relationship between liberty and security. Though the attacks were in New York, as you know, there were attacks shortly thereafter against the parliament in Delhi, and the terrorist threat is conceived as global, and the terrorists are regarded as those who can strike anywhere, at any time, at any moment. For this reason, it's argued that the threat from terrorism is not only ubiquitous, but being all-pervasive, requires a response that is different from those that have traditionally been used previously against external enemies. External enemies traditionally have been located in one territory, and the fights have been about territory or certain ideals. But in this case, the terrorist threat is believed to be, at least according to this debate on liberty and security, is believed to be an existential threat, a threat to a way of life, a democratic way of life, or a plural way of life. And consequently, this threat is regarded as a new kind of threat and a new kind of enemy. All of these new threats and new kinds of violations have urged philosophers to rethink the conceptual relationship between liberty and security. And the way that it has been rethought is through the model of a balance, the actual image of a balance. It's also argued that it is always necessary to balance liberty and security, even in normal times. That is, the argument is made that the balancing of liberty and security is not new. Executives, governments, military personnel have always been in the business of balancing liberty and security, and it's only in a post-September 11 environment where the public has become aware of this environment. So those who argue that we need to reconceive the relationship between liberty and security also put forward the idea that while the threat from terrorism is new, the requirement to balance is not new. It's only that the requirement to balance has now moved from the war room into the public domain. So what is this image of balance? The balance model was presented initially by Judge Richard Posner as a way to conceptualize the relationship between liberty and security. Judge Posner is known as the main supporter of the economic theory of law, which you would have read about in one of the earlier modules in this paper. In the present case, he is not arguing for an economic theory, but he is arguing for balancing these values of liberty and security according to the same kind of model that economists use. And I'll discuss that briefly in terms of the Pareto principle. Judge Richard Posner's balance model conceives of civil liberties as, I quote, a point of balance between concerns for personal liberty and concerns for public safety. So what you can see is that in this scale, there is liberty on one side, and there's security on another side. And as our liberty increases, our security decreases, and as the need for security increases, there will be more constraints on our liberty. This is what is meant by the model of the balance between liberty and security. This balance keeps on shifting based on the nature of the threat at hand. What that suggests is that in times of emergency, the need for security is heightened, and therefore the need to restrict liberty is also heightened. If we require more security, we will have less liberty. In times of emergency, obviously the balance shifts in favor of security. In times of peace and tranquility, or when there is no threat, the possibility of enlarging our liberty is there, and the need for security decreases. But what we notice then, precisely in this balance of increasing security and decreasing liberty, is that the rights, these civil rights as we call them, we can think of rights to privacy as being quite important in this case, rights of habeas corpus, that is, that I should not be put in jail without, within a brief period of time, appearing before a judge to understand the charges against me, and other crucially important rights protected under the regime of human rights, that these are not considered inalienable. If they were inalienable, how could they be put in a balance? In other words, as the need for security increases, the alienation of our rights also occurs. So this is a new conception about the inalienability of rights. We've known since the 18th century declarations that rights, human rights are considered inalienable, but considering the new nature of the threat, these philosophers argue, we have to reconceive this 18th century idea that rights are inalienable and instead frame them in terms of this balance. So rights should be calibrated in this balance by security agencies in such a way that when a slight expansion in the scope of a right would decrease public safety, then it should not be taken. If a slight increase in security can be achieved by an even slighter decrease of liberty, then the step can be taken. I'll rephrase that because it's a difficult concept to understand. If we are going to increase the security level, the amount that we are able to increase it should always be higher than the amount that we must decrease our liberty. And this is how we know if the balance is fair. So if we can increase our liberty to such an extent that the amount of security doesn't decrease that much, then it's fair. If in the process of increasing our liberty, we decrease our security by a larger measure, then it is an unsafe trade-off. Another key thing to understand here is that the model assumes a certain neutrality, or it claims a neutrality between the goods of liberty and security. Now, we all recognize liberty to be an inherent good, and we also recognize security to be an inherent good. The model here proposes that we understand them as equal and identical goods, and we don't favor one over the other. That's why we can balance them. The value assigned, according to Judge Posner, to the goods of liberty and security are not based on some absolute principle. They're not based on some Kantian deontological principle, or they're not based on something set in stone. Rather, it's a person's personal preference as to whether he or she prefers more liberty or more security. So I might be a particularly timid person concerned more about my security and therefore willing to give up certain rights to privacy that I enjoy. I may allow the government to tap my phone, record my activities, and so on, telling myself that, well, I'm doing nothing wrong, so it doesn't matter, and the amount of security that I enjoy as a consequence is worth it to me. So in Posner's model, he thinks that this is actually a personal preference, and no one can decide absolutely whether liberty is to be preferred over security or whether security is to be preferred over liberty. Now that's very nice, but the problem is that who is in a position to do that balance? As mentioned, it's the security agencies that can affect the balance. Why? Because they have the information. The security agencies know about the terrorist threat. I certainly don't. And the security agencies know how to tap phones, how to invade my privacy, and other techniques for either granting me my rights or removing my rights. So irrespective of the fact that liberty and security are allegedly equal values determined by my own preferences, in the end, the point of balance will have to be decided by the executive. This, anyway, is a constitutional provision. All constitutions around the world give security not to individuals or vigilantes, they give security to the executive power. There's a small footnote to this balance model that was created as what's called a trade-off thesis. And the trade-off thesis was put forward by another Posner, Erich Posner, in fact the son of Richard Posner. Erich Posner has tweaked in some respect the balance model, and he's made it more consistent with the quantitative reasoning of the social sciences, in specific the engineering and economic model known as the Pareto principle. This trade-off thesis is a particular interpretation of the balance model that conceptualizes liberty and security as being located along what's called the Pareto frontier. Now, what that means is that in this graphic illustration, so we're not dealing with an old-fashioned balance like Judge Richard Posner had, where the weight of security lightens our possibility for liberty and vice versa. This is a more scientific conception where a graph is created where there are points along this graph where we can optimize the relationship between liberty and security. This is called Pareto optimization in economics and social theory. So there is a frontier on this graph where the preference for one good will necessarily decrease another good. So if, for example, I want to increase my liberty, it necessarily will affect the security, and vice versa. If I'm going to increase security, it necessarily will decrease my liberty. Now, the virtue of this more social scientific approach is that the Pareto variables can be manipulated in such a way that we can actually optimize the relationship between liberty and security. And this is called the trade-off thesis of Erich Posner. So the Pareto frontier locates the optimal and the most efficient allocation of the goods. In this case, the goods are liberty and security, given the resources. The optimal point is always that where the gains in one good is higher than the losses in the other good. So this is an even clearer way of understanding what I think Judge Richard Posner was trying to get at with the balance. So how do we know how to trade off? How do we know how to balance? Well, we find the optimal point, which means that if the advantages to personal liberty are far greater than the deterioration of security, then we found an optimal point at which to understand the relationship between liberty and security. If we put a huge amount of effort in increasing our liberty very slightly and our security decreases dramatically, then we know that this is not an optimal arrangement. How we should find this optimal point is determined by the circumstances. So once again, just like in the balance model, if we find ourselves in a state of emergency, obviously it's going to be far easier to find optimizations of security by reducing liberty. If we find ourselves in a tranquil environment, then it will be much easier to spread the focus onto increasing liberty, and that should not, given that the circumstances are peaceful, deteriorate our security too much. So the Pareto optimization point alters based on the environment, whether it's an emergency environment or whether it's a tranquil environment. Well, what does this tell us? It tells us that the trade-off assumes that people are actually aware not only of the security situation, but also of their own preferences, what value they attribute to these situations. What value do I attribute to security versus what value do I attribute to liberty? What I'm trying to explain here is that How do I know it's an emergency situation? Doesn't that, in the first place, depend on how much liberty I'm willing to sacrifice? Someone may say that there is a clear and present threat that something should happen. But maybe that threat is, within my own point of view, not really such a threat to my security that I'm willing to sacrifice my liberty. So for this reason, the trade-off thesis also will attract certain criticisms, which I shall get to later in the module. The trade-off thesis, just like the balance model, requires that matters of security are deferred to the executive. Who knows better what the situation is? Who knows better how to deal with the situation in terms of the security prevention? And who is it anyway who is restricting my liberty? Always the executive powers. So once again, we have this suggestion that while I'm the one who may prefer liberty to security or security to liberty, nevertheless, given the constitutional order of government, it's always going to be the executive that makes that decision. Both the legislative and the judiciary also traditionally defer their judgment about any matter of national security to the executive, out of fear that the security situation is well beyond the control of a legislative body. Legislators have no police forces, legislators have no secret service. The judiciary also, they have no police forces, they have no secret service, they have lack of access to information. So why should they be the ones engaged in balance? They don't have the information. So the people themselves can't decide, the legislative body can't decide, the judiciary can't decide, everybody has to defer to the executive. Well, what does that mean in terms of this balance of liberty and security? It means very clearly that the executive branch may overreach its power. Even the model of balance assumes that if the executive overreaches its power, there will still be a benefit to the people in terms of the security that they enjoy as a result of the executive branch's overreach in power. An easy example of this is the United States drone strikes into the sovereign territory of the northwest frontier of Pakistan. So in this case, the act was considered illegal both by international law and US law. It was kept secret from the American people, and when it was revealed that the United States was illegally conducting drone strike operations in Pakistan, the executive branch said, yes, we may have been doing something that we shouldn't have been doing, but everybody's security is enhanced as a consequence. This brings us to criticisms of the model of the balance. I had mentioned that the model claims to be neutral among the goods of liberty and security. It states that it has no preference for security, it has no preference for liberty, it recognizes them both as equal goods that need to be in a balance. But is that really the case? Is it not the case that it's always the situation of security, emergency, and danger that determines how the shift in the balance will move? In other words, if security and liberty were really equal according to the balance model, then why would it not be the case that the balance should move in terms of the perception of threats to our rights rather than in terms of the perception of threats to our security? So the balance model, while it claims to be neutral between liberty and security, actually privileges security over liberty. And this privileging occurs on the basis of a general perception of fear. While it spreads or relies on a perception of fear, the irony, according to critics like Jeremy Waldron, is that it nevertheless doesn't even guarantee our security. So the claim is that a reduction in our liberty increases our security, according to the balance model. What the philosopher Jeremy Waldron has asked, where is the empirical evidence? where's the evidence that each time the executive power, reduces our security, taps our phones, tortures potential terrorists, detains minorities at airports or in detention centers, performs extraordinary rendition, conducts illegal drone strikes, all of these violations of liberty, where is the evidence that our security has in fact been enhanced? It turns out, according to Jeremy Waldron, that the only evidence emanates from that same executive power who has all the interest in decreasing our liberty, as it makes the protection of security much more easy for it to conduct. So there is no guarantee that by sacrificing liberties we will indeed be secure. And if that's the case, then the very model of the balance breaks down, because it's based on a fiction that increase in one decreases the other, decrease in one increases the other. But there's no empirical evidence for that claim. What there is empirical evidence for, on the contrary, is that when we work on increasing security, we always curtail liberty. So the suggestion that balancing will increase security is not supported, but the observation that increasing security decreases liberty is more or less universally visible. Another problem is that the security policy that the executive power might promote may claim to address the population's general security, while in fact it's targeting dissidents, opponents of government, or whoever the state feels threatened by. Now remember, security is not simply the security of the state, it's the security of the population. The state takes steps in reducing the liberties of the population in an attempt to ensure the security of the population. But this critique of the balance and trade-off model suggests that what the executive power may do is reduce the liberty of the population for increasing the security of the state. And this does not play into the model. Now, another critique is about deference. Deference requires an unqualified trust in the executive, which doesn't really have any rational basis. I mean, what guarantees do we have that when the legislature defers to the executive because of the executive's greater access to information and police force and so on, or when the judiciary defers to the executive, what rational basis do we have to believe that the executive is worthy of that deference? In fact, we're quite aware of the opposite, that the threat to liberty is as real from the state as it is from the terrorists acting against the state and the citizenry. There are countless cases of that in terms of extraordinary rendition, in terms of discovery of surveillance operations on a state's own citizenry by its own government, on wiretapping, phone tapping, and recording of videos on personal computers, and all sorts of examples. All of these violations are against citizens by the citizens' own state. And they've all been revealed through whistleblowers like Edward Snowden and WikiLeaks. And so what this tells us is that the idea of deference that is built in to the balance and trade-off models might be a little bit naive. What does deference do in terms of the operation of government? Deference to the executive undermines the constitutional controls on that executive. After all, the government separates its powers so that there can be checks and balances. We don't grant uncontrolled power to any branch of government, not to the judiciary, not to the legislature. So why should we grant it to the executive? That's one set of critiques that you can think of against the balance, that it interrupts the normal processes of government, that it violates basic principles of democracy in terms of checks and balances, access to information, and so on. There's another one that is another set of critiques that is very important. And that essentially wants to reassert the fundamental inalienability of personal liberty and our human rights. According to this view, rights are not entities that can be traded off. The very function of a right is to ensure a minimum level of protection to the right holder. Since the very point of a right is to ensure a minimum level, how can we offer that level up to trade-off and to balancing? This violates the very idea of rights and makes the rights absurd. Another problem is that the balance model raises serious concerns about distributive justice. In other words, how goods are distributed, or in this specific case, how burdens are distributed amongst people. The rights of minorities can be traded off to make the majority feel secure. In other words, in the liberty-security trade-off, why don't we just trade all of the rights of the minority in order to make the majority feel secure? Is there any mechanism built into the balance to prevent that from happening? Empirically, we know that since September 11, 2001, the Muslim community, the young men of the Muslim community especially, have borne most of the burden in terms of their rights and liberties in order to make the majorities, whether Hindu majority in India or the Christian majority in the United States or the United Kingdom. The majorities are feeling very secure on account of the minority sacrificing all of its rights. So it's not necessarily the case, as it seems to be presented at first, that what we're balancing is everybody's liberty for everybody's security. The model has no built-in mechanism to ensure that it's not just the liberty of a minority to ensure the security of a majority. And this is a serious problem. To conclude, the balance model does not give the guarantee whether sacrificing liberty will genuinely make people safer. However, the threat to liberty is quite real under the model. So we have only the illusion of security, whereas we have the reality of threats to our liberty. Also, the model grants unlimited power to the executive and can consequently threaten the rights of minorities, and certainly this power can be overused by the executive to target dissident groups under the guise of security. To sum up, the model seems to be genuinely anti-democratic in its character, because it doesn't account for rights or the equal enjoyment of liberty for all groups, minorities and majorities. And for this reason, it really seems like the balance model of liberty and security should be rejected in favor of a more inalienable approach to the preservation of our rights and liberties. Thank you.